Welcome, everyone, to another exciting episode of Return to Zion. And tonight we're actually kind of going to go a little bit beyond our Return to Zion text, maybe a lot beyond our Return to Zion text. And the reason for that is because as we were looking at the Netinim, which are a class we see specifically in the Return to Zion, and a little bit then later, kind of maybe in the second, but we don't really, it's hard to see them in the Second Temple because we have Ger mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but not, and there is a text that might refer to Netinim. I forgot to mention that last time. There's a list that might say the word Netinim, but I have my doubts. I looked at the they have infrared photos, etc., and I think it's pushing it a little to say that the word Netinim is there. It's like a Netinim and then list of names. I think it's a nice thought, but it's not super clear that it exists. And then when we have it later dealt with later in the Mishna, which seems to indicate that there was a group of Netinim that continued on, and that had a special status, as we discussed last time. And that kind of led us to the whole question of what are converts? When are there converts? When can we talk about a conversion? Okay. So let's start by talking about what would it mean in the biblical period. Let's say before First Temple period, what would it mean to be a convert? And it's not super clear because again, the assumption is going to be in the ancient world that a woman who marries out, quote unquote, is gone. She is now belongs to a different tribe, a different group. Whereas a woman who joins your group is now part of your group. And we see that again, famously, okay, Yehuda, he marries a Canaanite woman. And at that point, because you have already essentially the 12 tribes, quote unquote, it doesn't seem to be a big issue. We can see that a little bit later. I'm going to share my screen. So we have here in Vayikra Chaf Dalid Yud, which is Leviticus 24:10. Vayetze ben isha Yisraelit v'hu ben ish Mitzri b'toch b'nei Yisrael v'yinatzu b'machane ben ha-Yisraelit v'ish ha-Yisraeli. Here we actually do see that there's someone whose father is Egyptian. He's the son of an Israelite woman and an Egyptian man. He's in the camp, and there is a fight that breaks out between the son of the Israeli woman and a fully Israeli man. And what does the son of the Israeli woman say? He says the name, he uses God's name in a curse. Okay, he does something that you are not allowed to do. You are not allowed to curse with God's name, and the punishment is essentially death. And so he is brought to Moshe. What do we do with this guy, right? This is the name of his mother. In other words, it seems clear in this case that he either belongs to his mother's camp, or his father is an Egyptian who is one of the hangers-on, one of the Erev Rav, right? Who's a kind of joined on. And so this guy the point is that he's subject to the laws of the Yisraelim, of the Israelites. He, in fact, is placed under watch, and in fact, he's killed, right? He's killed because the punishment for this transgression is death, and he, as part of the camp, he belongs still to the Israelite tribe. It says specifically what tribe his mother belongs to, and that's where he is. And he has transgressed God's law, and so he's put to death. Okay, and he's put to death just as an Israelite would be. Note also the important point here, which we hear in other places in the Torah, which is that the laws should be applied equally, right? Like a person who lives with you as a citizen, everyone is equal in the eyes of the law, quote unquote, as opposed to, for example, the Code of Hammurabi, where different classes of people get different laws. So here, now, of course, I admit, like, slaves do have different rules, right? But the idea is, here's someone, he dwells among you, he gets the same law, all right? And it does seem to say that he kind of belongs, even though his father is clearly an Egyptian. So the question is does he count as a ger toshav, a stranger who dwells among you, essentially? And is that why he's getting the same law, or is he actually considered part of the Israelite community? And it seems a little bit of both, because it says specifically who his mother was. All right, so we already see that this is kind of flexible. Now, I would like to remind you, when we looked at Ezra and Nehemiah, and we looked at the thing where they're saying you must send away your foreign wives, there are two reasons. One is the biblical reason of they should not lead you to idol worship, right? And the other kind of social reason is that their children don't seem to be Israelite. Their children are speaking their mother's language. Their children belong to a different culture. They are not, in fact, joining us. All right. So those two reasons, both in different aspects, at different points, seem to be reason enough to send these women away. They are not part of the tribe. All right. Now, again, there is a biblical ordinance not to marry women of the nations that are being expelled when you settle the land. Right. You can absolutely read it as we're talking about women of those nations, not women of any nation. That's why Ammon and Moab have a special rule because of what they did to you. Because normally you could marry them because you're not supposed to expel Ammon and Moab. They are neighboring nations, but you don't marry them because of what they did to you in the desert, right? Egyptians have a special rule as well. They're a neighboring nation. The nations that you expel are the ones that you really are not allowed to marry ever. And of course, the exception to that are the Gibeonites, right, who kind of trick us into a treaty. But then the question is, okay, so are they converts? Can they marry you? And that's what we were talking about before, where the rabbis kind of connect them to the Netinim, who have been dedicated to temple service. Okay. Now what we're going to dive into is, let's look at the existence of what we call gerim, right? What we call a convert. So in biblical rules, we have a ger toshav. That's someone who dwells among you. You have to make sure, again, that they're protected, that they get justice, but it isn't clear. They're not exactly a member of the tribe, as it were. Okay. What we see in the Second Temple is that we do start having people that we would consider converts. Now, you might say, oh, look, the Septuagint, which is a translation of the Bible that happens during the Second Temple period, it translates ger toshav as a proselyte, proselytes, right? And you say, oh, great, so it's already translating it into a convert. The problem is we get the word proselyte from there. Proselyte is simply a translation of ger toshav. Proselyte simply means someone who came towards you. Right? A ger toshav is a stranger who dwells among you, someone who came towards you. So you could say that means a convert, or you could say that's someone who's dwelling among us, right? So let's take a look at some of the books of the period. And now we're going later then, right? So in Ezra and Nehemiah, we had the Netinim, right, who have, again, foreign names. We have Yeshayahu, Isaiah, saying people from, and in fact, we can go to first Isaiah, right? So let me actually open this up. So here, now we're talking, this is First Temple, right? We're not talking Second Temple here. First Temple, we see that Yeshayahu, Isaiah, says, right, God will have mercy on Yaakov, and he will choose Israel, and he will place them on their land, and these stranger will join them, and they will join the house of Yaakov. ולקחום עמים והביאום על מקומם ונחלום בית ישראל על אדמת אדוני לעבדים ולשפחות והיו שובים לשוביהם ורדו בנוגסיהם. Okay, the different nations will take them and bring them to their place, to their land, and the house of Israel will take possession of the land of God, and they will take them as servants, essentially, and they will be the captors of their captors, and they will be masters to their masters of the people who previously oppressed them. So the question is this a nice story about, there are going to be strangers who join the house of Yaakov? I think it's twofold. I think there's a recognition that there are going to be non-Jews who want to join the house of Israel, but also this idea that you will rule over them. You see this a little bit in Second Isaiah also, okay? But here you see a seed. And this also, by the way, why is, if you say that Second Isaiah is actually written much later, which according to like what it talks about Cyrus, etc., why would it be joined to First Isaiah? And the answer is there are absolutely places where the ideas connect and where the words connect. It uses similar language. This is one of them. We read earlier in Second Isaiah, the prophet talks about the non-Jew who was joined in the service of God. Here we also have a non-Jew who's joining the service of God. Okay, so it's not a completely different idea. But let's look at when we actually start to see this idea of people who are what we would call converts. And again, we saw a little taste of it with this idea that there are non-Jews or people of non-Jewish descent who are serving in the temple in some way. All right, let's take a look at some books of the Apocrypha. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at the Apocrypha, we're going to look at the Pseudepigrapha, we're going to look at, we mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls last time. That actually, you know what, we'll look at the Dead Sea Scrolls first because are they earlier? We'll go back and forth. We'll look at the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. Okay, so what are the Apocrypha? What are the Pseudepigrapha? In Hebrew, it's much easier. All of these things are called Sfarim Chitzoniyim together. They're called books external to the Bible. And you have this great name, Sfarim Chitzoniyim. These are books that are written by Jews in the Second Temple period that do not make it into the Bible. You can usually understand why. Either they don't seem holy, they just kind of seem fun, or they're history books. They're more to history. Well, actually, I should say that in terms of the Judean, what we have, our Tanakh, is what we could say the Judean Bible. That's what the Jews in Judea thought should get into the Bible. A lot of it seems to be kind of time-based. In other words, if the book itself dates itself to later than the Return to Zion, it's not going to make it into the Judean Bible. Okay? That is not true for the Jews in Alexandria. The Jews in Alexandria, if you've got a book which has a good message and is important, it fits generally with the more or less traditional Jewish approach, it can make it in. All right? Whether or not it's originally in Hebrew, whatever. So you have First Maccabees, you have Second Maccabees, right? These are kind of books that are telling stories about what happened in the Maccabean revolt. We have a book like Tobit, which is this great story with angels and demons and being, I always love saying being blinded by bird poop, but it's a great story, right? And it emphasizes the importance of burying your dead and prayer and how, kind of you can have miraculous salvation if you're a good person, all sorts of things like that. So it's got nice lessons. You have the book of Judith, which is a book kind of reflecting a Maccabean reality in a way, where you have a woman, the widow Judith, who kind of symbolizes Zion in her faithfulness. And she, of course, wins out through her cleverness and her purity, right? Her purity then allows her to kind of hint that she's not going to be pure because she is so pure. And she's able to win against Holofernes. So these are all good stories that make it into the Apocrypha. They make it into the Septuagint, which is the Alexandrian Jewish Bible. These books are all, whatever their original language, are all translated into Greek. Some of them were originally in Greek, like Second Maccabees. They are kept in Greek. They survive because the Christians, the early church, takes this Bible, which is already in Greek, they take the whole thing, they add the New Testament, and then they have their whole Bible. Because you can't have the New Testament without the Hebrew Bible, because the whole point of the New Testament is supposed to be that Jesus kind of is the embodiment of the prophecies of the Jews, right? So you need the prophecies of the Jews, but they needed it to be in Greek. So they took the Septuagint and had everything in Greek. So that's how these other books were added. Until the Reformation, the Protestants took these books out, right? Because they're not in the Hebrew Bible, so clearly they're apocryphal, right? They're not the real thing. Then we have what we call in English the Pseudepigrapha. The Pseudepigrapha are books that didn't make it into either. They didn't make it into the Alexandrian Jewish Bible. They didn't make it into the Hebrew Bible. They made it into some Christian canon somewhere, but we have good reason to believe that they are Jewish, right? So Jubilees, Enoch, those are pseudepigrapha. You'd be like, why didn't they make it into the Apocrypha at least? The answer is because they are super weird. And a lot of times they go against what is accepted Jewish law and accepted Jewish practice. You can totally get it, especially if you read Enoch, you totally get why it didn't make it into the Apocrypha. But both Jubilees and Enoch have survived in their entirety because the Ethiopian church kept it. That's why anyone who does a real study of Jubilees or Enoch usually needs to learn Gez, Ethiopic. However, we do have pieces of Jubilees in Hebrew that survived in the Dead Sea Scrolls, teeny little fragments. Enoch also different in Aramaic. There are teeny pieces in Aramaic that survived in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we have some pieces in Greek. We have a little bit in Greek that has survived. All these are from different periods, different historical backgrounds. Now let's take a look then at the book of Judith. The book of Judith is dated from 150, between 150 to 100 BCE, because it's generally read as written on the background of the Maccabean revolt and the Hasmonean period. Here we are, book of Judith. And this, of course, I'm showing you the English translation of the Greek. And here we have the character of Achior. Now, Achior is actually an Ammonite. He's from Ammon, which is interesting because, again, if you recall, people of Ammon are not actually supposed to be able to just kind of convert, and yet he does. I'm in chapter 14, verse 13. And when Achior had seen all that the God of Israel had done, he believed in God greatly, and he circumcised the flesh of his foreskin and was joined to the house of Israel unto this day. Okay? Achior sees the miraculous salvation and he converts. What is this converting? What does it consist of? It consists of him believing in God and getting circumcised and joining the house of Israel. Okay? This is a joining with belief, and he is now joining the house of Israel, and there doesn't seem to be any sort of, oh, but he couldn't really join. Okay? Seems like he could join. All right? Let's contrast this with the book of Jubilees, which is also it's generally considered to be after the Maccabean, is also around the same time. So was I say 160 BCE? Now, what's interesting here is I'm going to point something out to you. The book of Jubilees recounts the story of Genesis, of Breshit, up to the giving of the Torah. All right? That's a retelling of the biblical story. And here we have a retelling of the story of Dinah, who is raped, of course, by Shem. She's carried off by him. And so here we have something we should know about the book of Jubilees is that it generally tries to fix problems in the biblical text if it sees them. And we can kind of tell from Jubilees what are considered problems actually in the biblical text, yet it does assume that you kind of know the story. We're reading from chapter 30, and in the first year of the sixth week is groups of 7 years. It's called the book of Jubilees because it dates everything in Jubilees and Shmitot, right? And groups of 7 years. He went up to Salem, to the east of Shem, in peace in the 4th month, and there they carried off Dinah, the daughter of Yaakov, into the house of Shem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, the prince of the land, and he lay with her and defiled her, and she was a little girl, a child of 12 years. And he besought his father and her brothers, talking about Shem, he besought his father and her brothers that she might be given to him to wife. This is pretty close to the biblical text. And Yaakov and his sons were angry because of the men of Shem, for they had defiled Dinah. Note that there's something different here. What we already see a difference in the biblical story. What's the difference for the biblical story here? Just from what we read in verse 4. Look at the beginning of verse 4. Yaakov and his sons were angry. It's solving a problem for us. In the biblical text, there's a real disagreement here between Yaakov and his sons regarding what they do. Here, everyone's in agreement. No problem, okay? Yaakov and his sons are angry, for they had defiled Dinah, their sister, and they spoke to them with evil intent and dealt deceitfully with them and beguiled them. And Shimon and Levi came unexpectedly to Shem, and executed judgment on all the men of Shem, and slew all the men whom they found in it, and left not a single one remaining in it. They slew all in torments because they had dishonored their sister Dinah. Now, what do we notice here? What is the difference between this account and the biblical account? What did the men of Shem do in the biblical account that they don't do here?
They become circumcised.
They circumcise themselves. And here they don't. Now, I would argue the reason that they don't here is because, in fact, that would create a problem. I think that already you would say, wait a second, they circumcised themselves? They were willing to join and you killed them? That's not the way it's supposed to work, right? So we fix it, no problem. However, we do also kind of make it very, very clear cut, because let's continue reading. I'm going to skip over a little bit. And if there's any man, I'm reading verse 11, and if there's any man who wishes in Israel to give his daughter or his sister to any man who is of the seed of the Gentiles, he shall surely die, and they shall stone him with stones, for he has wrought shame in Israel, and they shall burn the woman with fire, because she has dishonored the name of the house of her father, and she shall be rooted out of Israel. So what is the story here? Either it's avoiding the problem. It's avoiding the problem of conversion. Is it trying to erase conversion? We don't know. All right. In other words, here there is no issue of conversion. No one's converting here. No one circumcised themselves. And it's telling you, and you're not allowed to give your daughter to someone of the seed of the Gentiles. So is it saying there's no such thing as conversion? Or is it just saying we're going to pretend there's no such thing as conversion because we like things to be clear cut? Okay, so it's very possible, though, that what we're seeing here is kind of an argument about conversion, right? Now, of course, Josephus tells us about the Idumeans, right, that were forced to convert. The Idumeans were forced to convert as a group, right, by the Hasmoneans. And that conversion, Shia Cohen has written about this. He wrote a book talking about what is conversion, etc. And his argument is that there are two essentially types, that there are two ways of being kind of a Judean. One is the religion, and one is being a citizen. And that from the point of view of the Hasmoneans, this is the way the Idumeans could be citizens. The Idumeans had to convert to be citizens, and they are now citizens. And there's a kind of a question among the Jews how valid this is. We kind of see this in a lot of echoes in terms of how is Herod really accepted as a Jew. Of course, his mother is a Nabatean. His mother's not an Idumean at all, right? But people don't talk about the issue being that his mother's a Nabatean. The issue is that his father's one of these Idumeans that were forced to convert, right? So we have a problem going on down to Agrippa, who's already a kind of a descendant. Why is there a question with Agrippa? Can he go into, and Josephus tells a story about this, about can Agrippa, is he allowed in the temple precincts as a king? And the question, why would you have this question? And possibly, and this is something that Joseph Baumgarten argues, possibly because of that feeling that their descendants of the Idumeans are not true converts. However, we also see, and let's take a look in another passage in Josephus of individuals converting. Of course, Josephus is much later, and now we're talking about the Roman Empire. Let's find it.
Isn't it implied somewhere that Herod's mother, Kypros, actually did convert, or maybe there was wishful thinking that she had converted?
I think it's more wishful thinking. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some reference to it, but I don't think that she converted, because she's a Nabatean and she's marrying an Idumean, and the Idumeans, they keep, by the way, the Idumeans keep their ethnic group, right? They identify as Idumeans while they're, and that's, I think, why Shia Cohen also is seeing it as, okay, they're citizens. They circumcised, so they're citizens. Are they, and they kind of are supposed to be kind of religious, but it seems to be it seems to be that from the point of view of the Hasmoneans, okay, you want to be full citizens, well, you're going to need to be circumcised and be part of our people in that way. But there are two different ways to be part of this group. Whereas is it a full religious conversion? Okay, so here, for example, in the Wars of the Jews, and we're looking in, this is in the Roman, this is already under the Romans. And thus were all these men barbarously murdered, except Metilius, for when he entreated for mercy and promised that he would turn Jew and be circumcised, they saved him alive, but none else. Circumcision is key here. And he's like, oh, no, I'm joining. So the question is, he's doing it to save his life. So here it's a little bit less clear. Here's another story in Josephus, a famous story of Helena, queen of Adiabene, and her son Izatus, who each convert independently, right? Each convert to Judaism independently. This is the Antiquities of the Jews 2017. The story starts at 2017. And in fact, what happens is, Izates is exiled, and in exile he essentially converts, but he doesn't circumcise himself until later. So when Izates comes back from exile, he becomes the king, and his mother, who was independently converted to Judaism, she's like, look, don't get circumcised because I'm worried about what the people are going to say. And in the end, essentially a rabbi he had spoken to one Jewish person on essentially converting, and another Jewish person who's stricter says, no, you really have to get circumcised. And he does. In fact, he is circumcised, and it seems to be okay, right? And so you have these two independent rulers who are of the same country she's not circumcised. They're two independent rulers who convert. And we see that in the Roman period, as we move through the Roman period, this is not completely unusual. Let's actually go back a little bit. We're still in the Roman period, but we're a little earlier than Josephus. Let's take a look at Philo. Philo is a Jewish philosopher living in Alexandria. He is what they call a Middle Platonist. He's before Neoplatonism, but he is he's in between Plato and Neoplatonism. So, and he lives and writes in Alexandria. And if we see how he talks about, he essentially already translates Ger Toshav of the Bible into converts of today. So let's take a quick look at two examples. Okay, this is on the virtues. Okay, and he's talking about Moshe, right? Moses. Chapter 20, section 102. Having laid down laws for members of the same nation, he holds that the incomers too should be accorded every favor and consideration as their due, because abandoning their kinsfolk by blood. Now, again, this is talking about how the Ger Toshav, the people, strangers who live among you, also get the same laws, also need protection, etc., also get justice. He holds that the incomers too should be accorded every favor and consideration as their due, because abandoning their kinsfolk by blood, their country, their customs, and the temples and images of their gods, and the tributes and honors paid to them, they have taken the journey to a better home, from idle fables to the clear vision of truth and the worship of the one and truly existing God. It's very clear he's describing a convert. He's describing someone who has not just moved to your country. He has abandoned his family. He has left his gods. And now he's going to the clear vision of truth and the worship of the one and truly existing God. And similarly here on the special laws, he says, all of like sort to him, all who spurn idle fables and embrace truth in its purity, whether they have been such from the first or through conversion to the better than others, anyone who is born Jewish or someone who has converted, right? Through conversion to the better side have reached that higher state, obtain his approval. The former because they were not false to the nobility of their birth. In other words, they were Jews and they stayed Jews. The latter because their judgment led them to make the passage to piety. They, through their own reason, came to Judaism. These last he calls proselytes, or newly joined, because they've joined the new and godly commonwealth. He's quoting proselytes from the Septuagint translation of Ger Toshav, right? In other words, he's saying, why are they called proselytes? Because they've newly joined the Jewish people. Now, proselyte, again, just means someone who's just come, right? Someone who's come. You could absolutely get there as a relatively literal translate. Not exactly literal, but someone who's come to the land, right? But Philo is loading the meaning on, no, they are someone who's joined the Jewish people because they've joined the new and godly commonwealth. Thus, while giving equal rank to all incomers with all the privileges which he gives to the native born, he exhorts the old nobility to honor them not only with marks of respect, but with special friendship and with more than ordinary goodwill. And surely there is good reason for this. They have left, he says, being Moshe, he says, their country, their kinsfolk, and their friends for the sake of virtue and religion. Let them not be denied another citizenship or other ties of family and friendship, and let them find places of shelter standing ready for refugees to the camp of piety. For the most effectual love charm, the chain which binds indissolubly the goodwill which makes us one is to honor the one God. Okay, in other words, let them join, and note, let them not be denied another citizenship or other ties of family and friendship. Philo's like, these converts should be able to marry and be part of the community. They are now part because they've left all their old things and they have joined the God. In general, Philo was very pro-convert, right? And there's even a passage where some think that he may actually kind of be a little bit for getting converts, right? Now, he is living, again, he's living at the very end of the Second Temple period. He's living at around 40 CE, so the temple is standing, and he is living in the diaspora. And as a diaspora of Jew, he is absolutely pro-convert. He's describing people who are converting, and he's saying they should be part of your community. Now, again, what we saw in elsewhere is what is part of what seems to be assumed becoming a convert is to be circumcised. So, yes.
So his ger is a ger tzedek in our terms. He doesn't seem to have the ger tzedek.
Absolutely, 100%. The same way that we will frequently read ger. He's not necessarily just that even reading ger Toshav. He's reading ger. He's reading ger, the stranger, right? Because it says in the Torah, be kind to the stranger. And when we're reading it biblically, we say, oh, they mean the ger Toshav. We mean the person who is settled among us. And he is reading it the way we often read it because he's using the modern quote unquote meaning of ger. He's reading it as convert. You should be kind to the convert. You should welcome the convert. You should take care of the convert, right? And that's how he's reading it, period. Okay. Let's take a look at a couple more interesting things as we move later into the Roman Empire. So now we're kind of moving past the destruction and looking at converts as they appear. This is an interesting little text here. This is a Juvenal's Satires. Juvenal is from 100 to 127 AD, right? CE, as we say, right? And here, what I'm reading is here. He's kind of laughing at people who are becoming Jewish over generations. He says, some who have had a father who reveres the Sabbath worship nothing but the clouds and the divinity of the heavens. How silly are these guys? They're just worshiping the heavens. There's no idol. There's nothing. Who have had a father who reveres the Sabbath, worship nothing but the clouds and the divinity of the heavens, and see no difference between eating swine's flesh, from which their father abstained, and that of man, and in time they take to circumcision. What's going on here? Okay. Their father already starts keeping the Shabbat. He doesn't eat pork. Then his son already is like, I would never eat pork. I'd as soon eat a person as eat pork, right? And in time, they take to circumcision. Eventually, they start circumcising themselves. Having been wont to flout the laws of Rome, they learn and practice and revere the Jewish law and all that Moses committed to his secret tome, right? Forbidding to point out the way to any not worshiping the same rites. They don't just tell people what they're doing, right? The Torah somehow is secret, okay? And conducting none but the circumcised to the desired fountain. For all which the father was to blame, who gave up every seventh day to idleness, keeping it apart from all the concerns of life. Who's to blame? The father started keeping Shabbat. How lazy. And now look what happened. Now look what the sons are doing. Now they're just being Jewish. Ah. Okay. That is a Roman talking about people who are eventually join the Jewish people, right? A very interesting idea that they kind of do it almost over generations. And what it seems to be is that you have these, and we know it from other places. If we look at this inscription, this is the Aphrodisias inscription, dating from around 300 CE. Actually, 300 to 500 CE. Some say that one side, I was just reading an article that argues that one side is from 300 and the other side is from 500. And so it's a little bit hard to interpret if this should have the text. Yes, here we have the text. And here what we have is, and what's interesting, actually, I do want to point something out here, that we actually have someone who's called a convert, right? We have Sabbatios, proselytos, the proselyte, Sabbatios Amachio, right? The proselyte Sabbatios, son of Amachio, sorry, who is someone who seems to be actually a convert, who's part of one of these donors, one of these Jewish donors. Note how most of the Jews have Jewish names. You have Binyamin here, you have Yehuda here, right? So we have other. This is Yoshes. So is that Hoshea or maybe more like Yoshiyahu, right? And then we have people who don't have such Jewish names, right? And this is not clear. So we have this word Theosebis, right? It's here, Theosebis. Theosebis means essentially a God-fearer, okay? A righteous person. And it's used in texts of this period by Jews and Christians to mean a God-fearer. And it could just mean a righteous person, or it could mean someone who's joined. So here, if we go on the next group, we have here, these are the God-fearers. Kaihosai Theosebis, right? And then we have a bunch of non-Jewish names. Zenon, Tertullus, Diogenes, Onesimus, Zenon, another Zenon, a whole bunch of non-Jewish names. So it seems to be that in this case, at least these people are called Theosebis, God-fearers. They're not Jews, they are God-fearers. They are people who are non-Jews who have yet attached themselves to the synagogue and have donated to the building of this synagogue. Now, of course, and here we are into 300 to 500 CE. This is later on.
Where is this synagogue located?
It's in Asia Minor, Aphrodisias.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so here we have what seems to be a group of Jews who are, perhaps if we look back at Juvenal's Satires, we're saying, okay, these are those people. These are those people, they're keeping Shabbat. They're maybe not being circumcised. They haven't fully converted, but maybe their sons will be something else. So it's unlikely that this would probably be more likely to be 300 rather than 500, because it wouldn't be at a time when Jews are being persecuted by Christians in the Roman Empire, right? That's not when you're going to have a lot of non-Jews saying, hey, look at me, I'm joining a synagogue, right? So it would be more likely to be earlier rather than later. But it could be that this is the same sort of idea, that there are non-Jews who are kind of attaching themselves to synagogues, and maybe later on there's circumcision, which kind of counts as seems to kind of count as conversion for a lot of people. Or at least that's what you're saying. You're saying, okay, they say that joining Jewish people, and they circumcise themselves, and now, okay, they're in. And so let's take a quick look backwards now. Let's look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls, again, are, so we've kind of, sorry that I skipped over that. We still have a few minutes. So we kind of saw this continuous idea of converts. What is the attitude in the Dead Sea Scrolls to converts? So we have a couple different attitudes. We are going to look at the Damascus document. All right. So here it's talking about the rank of people in the camps, right? The rule of dwelling in all the camps. All shall be Muslims, because remember that from the point of view of the Dead Sea sect, their their kind of settlement is based on the idea of the camp in the desert, right? So there's an order of dwelling of how they are going to live there. The rule of dwelling in all the camps. All shall, and I'm reading for this is column 14 in Damascus document. All shall be mustered by their names: the priests first, the Levites second, the children of Israel third, the proselyte fourth. Then they shall be recorded by name, one after the other: the priests first, the Levites second, the children of Israel third, the proselyte fourth. In other words, the converts are a full member of the camp. Converts can come into the camp. Converts can be a group. Yeah, they sit after the Israelites, but that's just because they're not born into the group. But they have full status. On the other hand, I'll remind you of what we read earlier in 4Q Florilegium, right, last week, that said that converts, that people who have joined are not allowed to be part of are not allowed to kind of go into be part of the temple, right? And we had something like that as well. Okay, so here we are in 4Q Florilegium. We looked at this last time. This is the house, the temple. Asher lo yavo shama ad olam va'amoni u'moavi u'mamazer u'venechar v'ger ad olam, right? Who is not going to come into the temple? This is where an Ammoni, a Moavi, an Ammonite, a Moabite, a mamzer, a halachic bastard, a foreigner, and a ger. What it seems to be here, one assumes that right now we're talking about a convert. They can't come in. Now, again, there are two ways to read it in Florilegium, because it talks about a Mikdash Adam, a human temple. Is it saying that they can't join the community, as opposed to the Damascus document, which was very clear that they can? Or is it saying they can't go into the temple? Now, in the temple scroll, they can't go into the temple. So it's possible that that's what's going on. Now, by the way, if you're familiar with the warning that they found on the stone, the cornerstone, the stone that used to stand at the entrance to the temple that said a foreigner can't come in, it's specifically a foreigner. It's not a convert, right? So it doesn't seem to be referring to a convert there. So we wouldn't say that this belongs to a convert. Now you could also say here, oh, maybe it's referring to a ger toshav, to the sojourner from the biblical sojourner. At this point, and again, because we looked at a lot of different accounts that seem to say that at this point there are converts. So I think that at this point it's very probable that ger actually means a convert. And so we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, there seems to be a different attitude towards converts. It's conflicting attitudes towards converts.
Mary, just a quick question. When it says, if we're assuming it means the temple itself, we don't mean the Azara, we mean the temple itself.
No, it would mean the whole temple precinct. That's a good question. No, it would mean the whole area. Okay, because anyway, a member of just Israel would not be able to get really into the where the service is so much, right?
Why not just assume they're talking about a ger, meaning not a convert?
I'll tell you. Okay, you can, especially because it's saying an Ammonite and a Moabite, so it's going back to the biblical text, right? Because why are you talking about Ammonites and Moabites, right? And the fact that it says an Ammonite and Moabite in this text, the text that we read together, it seems to indicate that maybe it really is talking about the community, because Ammonites and Moabites can't convert the same way, right? So is it talking about joining the community rather than entering a temple? The truth is, you could say that, but there's also good reason to say that it's a convert, just because at this point there are converts. You understand? Because at this point there are converts. At this point, people are understanding the word to mean convert. Proselyte is a convert, right? But it's a convert because the Septuagint translates ger as proselyte. And from that meaning, it becomes the word for convert, right? So for Philo, that becomes the word for convert. For us, that becomes the word for convert. For Christians, that becomes the word for convert because of that translation to begin with. So the question is, how much is that? So how much can we say, okay, so if they're saying ger, do they automatically in this period mean convert? And you're right, it is a question. I always think it's very interesting to this whole idea that Paul when he goes around the Mediterranean and he starts speaking in synagogues, that's how he reaches Gentiles, right? Or at least it's a way that because there are Gentiles hanging around synagogues, right? And here's this guy saying, hey, you can have all this good stuff and you don't need to circumcise yourself. This is like, pretty good. So it's interesting that this is already a thing where you have people who are kind of attracted to the Jewish religion.
One more question in that the sections from Philo where he's being so welcoming to converts, do you think that's an indication that there was a significant amount of conversion in Alexandria?
I think that there were clearly at least converts. How many of them? I think that it's interesting. I once heard a lecture that talked about the different attitude to converts in the Babylonian Talmud versus the Jerusalem Talmud. And the Jerusalem Talmud is much more positive to converts than the Babylonian Talmud is. And the argument was because in Babylon, there was a good reason to be a Jewish convert because you could really make very good business connections that way. The Jews in Babylon did very well for themselves. Or not in Babylonia. The Jews in the Sasanian Empire did very well for themselves. The Jews in that area did well. And in fact, there's even an account of a Gentile, of someone who converted, I shouldn't say a Gentile, someone who converted, who became a very successful businessman. So they had their kind of doubts of why is this guy converting? Whereas in the Jerusalem Talmud, which is written in the land of Israel during the Byzantine Empire, it's a horrible place and time to be a Jew. So if someone's joining the Jewish community under the Byzantine Empire, that guy really wants to be a Jew. No one's doubting this guy. So that they have a much more positive attitude towards converts. And so it could be that from Philo's perspective, in fact, he sees that anyone who's joining the Jewish community in Alexandria, they're really giving up a lot. Right? Alexandria is an intellectual center. Someone who's joining the Jews in that intellectual center is really giving up quite a bit. And I think there must have been converts, and he's very pro converts, and I think he does kind of see this as a kind of the way that things should go, right? That people should kind of be, see the light of Judaism kind of and join. So, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there are a lot. It just means that, I mean, it means probably that he doesn't see that there's a material reason to convert if you don't believe. Even though I think the Alexandrian Jewish community did pretty well for themselves, but I think in general, they were still, there's the whole issue of citizenship, all that sort of thing. So I think that there are reasons to not convert. So now about Juvenal and his satires, I think that if we think back to it, it actually makes sense if you say, oh, okay, so the father's keeping Sabbath and Shabbat, and he's hanging around and he's starting to do Jewish customs. And then it sounds like what he's describing is then he raises his child Jewish. He circumcises his son because why not? So he circumcises his son, and then the son is just Jewish because the son's circumcised. He's already been raised to not eat pork and to keep Shabbat. And that possibly you could absolutely see as that being a kind of route to Judaism almost for someone who didn't want to go the whole hog, so to speak, on their own. The question, of course, is that I was expecting to hear, but I didn't hear from any of you, is so what does the matrilineal aspect of it come in, right? When do we have that? We have that in the Mishna. That's where we first see it, is this idea that it goes by the mother, and that's how you determine it's in, we're already out of time, but there's the Mishna in Kedushin, which explains that it's matrilineal. In fact, it's not clear how much this was accepted. In the book of Acts, there's someone named Timothy who is, Paul says to him, his mother's Jewish. And Paul's like, okay, you get circumcised and then you can kind of preach to the Jews. And there seems to be this idea that he is not Jewish until he circumcises himself and essentially converts, right? Of course, you could say that it's simply because he's not already circumcised, that he wasn't circumcised. So it's hard to say that he's part of the Jewish people, despite his mother being Jewish. But it does seem to indicate that the idea of matrilineal descent is perhaps not as clear as it becomes later in the Mishnah. as it becomes a later and the codification of the Mishnah. Any questions?
It seems like for Chazal if Chazal established matrilineal, I don't know, Jewish identity, then you would think they couldn't have just sort of popped that out of nowhere. You'd think there would have
I
been
don't
some
think-
sort of
no,
established
I don't
tradition
think-
already.
I think it's an established tradition. I don't think it's coming out of nowhere. And then the question becomes, why, right? So why would it be matrilineal descent? And there's always the thing of like, oh, because you know for sure, right? If it's her child, you know that you know for sure it's from her, and that's one possibility. I remember seeing a show about descendants of Marranos in South America. And what was interesting was that they had all sorts of interesting customs. They kind of put everything in Pesach, right? And everything was passed down by the women. The women would be like, okay, now we're doing the matzot. The women would be like, and everything was kind of going through the mother or the aunt and it was a very interesting thing because it was all hidden. It was all in the home, right? So it was all going through women. So I don't know why it would be specifically matrilineal. I don't think that they came up with it on their own. I'm just saying that it wasn't super obvious. And I do think, again, the reason for him to say, okay, you need to get circumcised in Acts is because, yeah, you need to be circumcised. How can you go preach to the Jews and say you're Jewish if you're not circumcised, whether or not his mother is Jewish?
When
Well,
does mikvah become part of the circumcision, become
Okay,
part
that's
of the
also in the
conversion?
Mishnah. That's also in the Mishnah.
The
It's
Mishna.
also in the Mishnah.
Okay.
But,
Mhm.
and you could see that it wouldn't be a big stretch anyway. Like, it wouldn't need to be mentioned to us particularly because, particularly in the Second Temple period, purification is so important. It would be obvious that he would need to do it. Like, he's clearly not pure. He's been a Gentile and he's been touching all sorts of stuff. So he would of course have to go to the mikveh, right, in the Second Temple period. Like, it wouldn't even be a question. So I don't think that that would have been like a big stretch. Like, oh wow, we're coming up with this new thing. But that also we see in the Mishnah.
Miriam,
Yes.
if the debate around Herod revolved around his patrilineal lineage, and Herod was a contemporary of Hillel, so that's already into the Tannaitic period. So this transition from patrilineal to matrilineal happens within the Mishnaic period, it seems.
Right. So first of all, he's a king, so it's a whole different issue because a lot of times kings, you really look at the father, and it doesn't even get there. It's not like, oh, his mother was Jewish. If his mother was Jewish and they were all hung up on the father, that would be one thing. But his mother wasn't Jewish either, so it's not clear if his father had been completely Jewish, like everything's great, and he had a Nabatean mother. I assume that they would have said, "Oh, she must have converted." I don't know how much we can learn from the fact that they're not really hung up on his mother, because if his mother were Jewish and they'd be like, "Well, it doesn't matter," then they would be like, "Oh, okay." So then there's an issue. But since his mother was not Jewish and his father came from this strange background from a point of view of the Jewish people, it's hard to know, right? Again, with kings, you tend to pay a lot of attention to the father. So, and any other questions or comments? So just to wrap up, I think we've seen what's fascinating is there are different attitudes, but what certainly becomes clear as we move through the Second Temple period into the Roman Empire, and then actually towards like the Byzantine period, is that there are always converts and people who are about to join, and for the most part, it seems that these converts are accepted and that there are ways to join the Jewish people. Whether the citizenship conversion of the Idumeans kind of is considered to hold or not, right? That's a separate question. But it seems like there's from relatively early in the Second Temple period. Well, certainly, like from Ezra and Nehemiah, we see this idea of the Netinim, which is a separate question. And then we see as we go through text and some from the Damascus document, for example, which, okay, it's much later. We're already in like, let's say 160 BCE. But we see that there's this idea that their converts can join the Jewish people, and that there's a way to join the Jewish people. Certainly from his point of view of a diaspora Jew like Philo, this is only a good thing, right? And especially if we look at the synagogue donors in Aphrodisias, that's also that you have a list of people who are God-fearers who are donating to the synagogue. We see that there are people who are possibly not quite converts, maybe, and who are joining, and maybe, as Juvenal says, maybe their children then are kind of the full converts. So it's an interesting idea. Interesting. We see an interesting range of people joining the Jewish people. So thank you for joining me. And I hope this was interesting for everyone.
That was very interesting.
Yeah, thank
Thanks,
you.
Marion.